Joint American and Israeli strikes on Iran are rapidly expanding into a broader regional conflict. What began as a campaign targeting Iran's military infrastructure is now pushing the Middle East toward a multi-theater war unlike anything seen in recent years. President Trump has described the operation as a systematic effort to destroy Iran's ability to threaten U.S. South interests by targeting its missile arsenal, naval forces, nuclear program, and proxy networks. But the campaign now appears to go far beyond deterrence. Explosions have been reported across Tehran, including near the presidential palace, the Supreme Leader's compound, and facilities connected to senior Iranian security officials. Multiple reports suggest that several high-ranking figures may have been killed in decapitation strikes, including possibly the Supreme Leader himself. Thick smoke and repeated detonations across the capital signaled that the objective may have shifted from containing Iran to breaking its political will entirely. Iran sees the conflict as existential and has responded by dramatically expanding the battlefield. Hundreds of Iranian missiles and drones have reportedly struck economic and military targets across Jordan, Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Syria, and the UAE. In the opening wave, Iran fired nearly as many missiles at Arab states as it did at Israel itself. Both sides are now climbing the escalation ladder, but for different reasons. Trump appears convinced that Iran either cannot or will not escalate beyond a certain point. Iran, meanwhile, believes Trump cannot politically sustain a prolonged regional war. That assumption is now driving both sides deeper into confrontation. Trump's confidence is shaped by previous foreign policy decisions where major warnings failed to materialize into significant consequences. In 2018, he moved the U.S. South Embassy to Jerusalem, despite predictions of massive unrest. In 2020, he ordered the assassination of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani, despite fears of uncontrollable escalation. Critics also warned that direct strikes on Iran in 2025 would accelerate Tehran's nuclear ambitions, but the immediate fallout appeared limited. More recently, Trump intervened in Venezuela and captured President Maduro with minimal international backlash. Each time, the political system absorbed the shock, reinforcing Trump's belief that decisive action works. However, this conflict may be fundamentally different. The United States has assembled its largest military buildup in the region since the 2003 Iraq invasion. Major naval forces are now operating in both the Eastern Mediterranean and the Arabian Sea. Open-source tracking data showed more than 80 C-17 Globemaster strategic airlift flights in the days leading up to the conflict, alongside continuous deployments of KC-46 Pegasus and KC-135 Stratotanker refueling aircraft. These logistics operations allow the U.S. South military to sustain combat operations without depending entirely on vulnerable regional airbases that remain within range of Iranian missiles and drones. At the same time, advanced combat aircraft have poured into the region, including F-22 Raptors, F-35 Lightning IIs, F-15E Strike Eagles, and F-16 Fighting Falcons. Trump has also indicated that B-2 stealth bombers remain on standby. These are the same bombers used during previous strikes against Iran's underground nuclear facilities in June 2025. However, future deployment may depend on the remaining supply of GBU-57 bunker buster bombs, many of which were reportedly expended during earlier operations. The scale of the buildup gives Trump far more flexibility than he had during earlier confrontations. In the opening phase of the war, the United States and Israel did not limit strikes to nuclear or missile facilities. They also targeted broader elements of Iran's military, political, and security infrastructure, including major IRGC facilities. The strategic goal now appears to be forcing Tehran into sweeping political concessions that resemble capitulation. If military pressure alone fails, Washington and Jerusalem may attempt to increase domestic instability inside Iran through public unrest or by exploiting ethnic and political divisions. But this strategy carries risks. It would require a prolonged and costly commitment, and Iranian leaders believe Trump lacks the domestic political support needed to sustain that level of escalation over time. At this stage, escalation is no longer accidental, it is deliberate. Iran understands that it cannot defeat the United States or Israel in a conventional war. Instead, it is pursuing asymmetric retaliation designed to impose political, economic, and psychological costs rather than military victory on the battlefield. In theory, Tehran's most rational option would be rapid de-escalation, similar to previous confrontations in 2024 and 2025. But Iranian leaders believe the strategic environment has changed dramatically. They increasingly view Washington and Jerusalem as seeing Iran as weak and exposed. Many of Iran's proxy militias have been weakened, its nuclear infrastructure damaged, and its air defense systems severely degraded. Iranian officials now appear convinced that unless they impose major costs on the United States immediately, they will remain vulnerable to future attacks indefinitely. Last week, the Supreme Leader threatened to sink a U.S. South aircraft carrier and close the Strait of Hormuz. The IRGC may now feel pressured to demonstrate that those threats were not empty rhetoric. One major vulnerability for the United States is the approximately 40,000 American troops stationed across regional bases, all within range of Iranian missiles. From Tehran's perspective, inflicting U.S. South casualties carries enormous symbolic value. Iranian leaders still remember the 1983 bombing of the Marine barracks in Beirut, where 241 American personnel were killed. Following the attack, President Reagan eventually withdrew U.S. South forces from Lebanon, despite earlier promises not to yield under pressure. Iran hopes to revive that historical narrative by increasing American casualties and undermining domestic support for the war. Polling data suggests this calculation may not be entirely unrealistic. A Quinnipiac survey from mid-January indicated that roughly 70% of Americans oppose military intervention in Iran, including a majority of Republicans. Tehran believes that if U.S. South casualties rise significantly, Trump may struggle to justify a widening conflict politically. Another asymmetric option for Iran is disrupting global energy markets by threatening or temporarily closing the Strait of Hormuz. Such a move would severely impact global oil shipments, increase energy prices, and create immediate economic pressure worldwide. More importantly, it would generate political pressure on the White House domestically. Iran is also attempting to indirectly pressure Trump through the Gulf Arab states. Despite historical tensions, relations between Iran and several Gulf governments have improved somewhat in recent years. Tehran understands that Gulf leaders possess influence in Washington and may push Trump toward de-escalation if their own economies and security come under sustained attack. This appears to explain why Iran has targeted economic and strategic infrastructure across Jordan, Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Syria, and the UAE. By threatening the stability of these states, Iran hopes to transform Gulf vulnerability into political leverage against Washington. However, this strategy could easily backfire. Instead of pressuring the United States to end the war, Iranian attacks on Arab states could push those governments into openly joining the American-Israeli military campaign. That possibility creates a dangerous cycle where every attempt at coercion risks triggering even broader escalation. The conflict has now entered a phase where neither side believes it can afford to appear weak. Trump believes Iran will eventually fold under pressure. Iran believes the United States lacks the endurance for a prolonged regional war. History shows that wars driven by assumptions are often the hardest to control.